I'm Rebecca, 29, and my son Oliver is the light of my life. He's 10 years old, intelligent beyond his years, and has the biggest heart of anyone I know. My relationship with my in-laws, Margaret and Richard Thompson, and my sister-in-law Sarah, has always been complicated. When I left Oliver with them for a weekend work retreat, I never imagined that 2 days later I'd be rushing him to the emergency room with a shoulder injury they'd ignored for hours because boys need to toughen up. Before I continue with this story, let me know where you're watching from the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I handled this devastating betrayal of trust. Life as a working single mother isn't easy, but Oliver and I have created our own little world. After David died in a car accident 3 years ago, I've been determined to give Oliver stability and love while processing our own grief. David's life insurance helped us stay afloat, but I still work full-time as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup. Oliver understands our situation with wisdom that sometimes breaks my heart. He's never complained about our smaller apartment or the fact that we can't afford the expensive camps his friends attend. My relationship with David's family has been strained since before he died. Margaret and Richard Thompson live in an impressive colonial house in an affluent suburb about an hour from our downtown apartment. It's the kind of neighborhood where every lawn is perfectly manicured and every family drives luxury SUVs. David grew up there with his younger sister Sarah, in an environment where appearances mattered above all else. Richard, a successful investment banker, expected excellence from everyone around him. Margaret, a former debutante who'd never worked outside the home, was obsessed with proper behavior and social status. Their criticism was subtle but constant. My casual wardrobe, my middle-class background, my decision to keep working after Oliver was born. Even now, 3 years after David's death, I still felt like an outsider who'd somehow trapped their precious son. Then there's Sarah, 2 years younger than David, but somehow always the favored child. The perfect daughter who married well, lived in the right neighborhood, and produced 2 picture-perfect children who attended elite private schools. Sarah could do no wrong in her parents' eyes, while David had constantly struggled to meet their impossible standards. Even in death, I sometimes felt like David was still competing with his sister for their approval. Despite everything, I maintained contact because I believed Oliver deserved to know his father's family. They loved him in their own rigid way. Oliver enjoyed the pool at their house, the elaborate holiday celebrations, and the expensive gifts they showered on him. I tried to shield him from their subtle criticisms about my parenting choices, the same way David had tried to shield me when he was alive. So when my boss selected me for a crucial client retreat in Denver, a 2-day intensive that could lead to the promotion I'd been working toward for months, I reluctantly arranged for Oliver to stay with Margaret and Richard for the weekend. "It's only 2 days, Mom," Oliver said, packing his soccer ball and favorite books. At 10, he was at that wonderful age where he was still my little boy, but developing his own interests and opinions. His blonde hair fell into his green eyes as he concentrated on choosing which books to bring, and my heart swelled with love for this remarkable child. "I'll be fine," he continued. "Plus, Grandpa Richard said we might go to the baseball game on Saturday." I double-checked his suitcase, adding an extra inhaler for his mild asthma. "Just remember to use this if you feel wheezy, especially if you're running around outside." "I know, Mom." He rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "We've talked about this a million times." We had, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the importance of the retreat, or perhaps it was the way Sarah had invited herself to spend the weekend at their parents' house. Sarah's presence always shifted the family dynamic, making Margaret and Richard even more focused on maintaining their image of the perfect family. Friday afternoon, I drove Oliver to the Thompson house. The property looked impressive in late spring, with blooming dogwoods and perfectly maintained gardens surrounding the imposing brick structure. Margaret greeted us at the front door, immediately critiquing Oliver's t-shirt. "That's hardly appropriate for dinner," she said, ushering him inside. "I've laid out some nicer clothes for the weekend." I bit my tongue, watching Oliver's face fall slightly. Richard appeared from his study, barely acknowledging me while focusing entirely on Oliver. "We're going to have a great weekend, sport. No video games, no television. Real activities that build character." The implications that I somehow didn't provide character-building activities for my son weren't lost on me. Sarah arrived just as I was preparing to leave, making a grand entrance with her perfect children, Madison and Carter, who were 8 and 6 respectively. She swept Oliver into an overly dramatic hug. "There's my favorite nephew. Ready for a weekend of fun with Aunt Sarah?" Oliver smiled politely, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders. Sarah's attention was always overwhelming, performative rather than genuine. Before leaving, I pulled Margaret aside in the kitchen. "Mom Thompson, Oliver sometimes gets anxious at night in new places. If he needs to call me even late, please let him." Margaret waved dismissively. "Rebecca, we raised 2 children successfully. I think we can manage one 10-year-old for 2 days. We don't coddle children in this family. They need to learn independence." The subtle criticism of my parenting wasn't surprising, but it still stung. Also, he's been complaining about his shoulder hurting after soccer practice this week. Nothing serious, but if it bothers him, there's children's ibuprofen in his bag. Richard overheard from the doorway. "A little soreness builds character. When David played football, he learned to push through minor discomfort. That's how boys become men." When Sarah appeared as I was saying goodbye, she barely acknowledged me before turning to Oliver. "We're going to have such an adventure weekend. Uncle James is coming for dinner tomorrow with stories from his latest business trip to Europe." Of course, James would be there. Sarah's husband, another successful banker who fit perfectly into the Thompson family's vision of appropriate masculinity. As I hugged Oliver goodbye, I whispered, "Be good, sweetheart. Call me tonight before bed, okay? I love you more than anything." "Love you too, Mom."
"Don't worry about me."
"Your retreat is going to be great, and you're going to get that promotion." As I drove away, I watched Oliver in my rearview mirror, standing between his stern-faced grandparents and his overly enthusiastic aunt. That image would haunt me later, my trusting, gentle son surrounded by people who would prioritize their own convenience over his well-being. The Denver retreat started promisingly. My presentation on innovative digital marketing strategies for the healthcare sector was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, and Friday's networking sessions provided valuable connections with potential clients. Still, I found myself checking my phone frequently, hoping for updates from Oliver. Friday evening, I called the Thompson house as planned. Margaret answered curtly. "Oliver is fine. He's already in bed. We had a busy day getting him properly oriented to our schedule. Could you wake him?" I promised I'd say goodnight. "Rebecca, don't be ridiculous. The child needs rest, not to be disturbed because you're feeling insecure about being away." I swallowed my frustration, recognizing Richard's dismissive tone in Margaret's words. "Can you just have him call me first thing tomorrow? We're going to the baseball game early."
"He'll call you when we get back."
Before I could protest, she hung up. I tried texting Oliver directly, but the message showed as undelivered. I reasoned that the Thompson house, despite its affluence, had notoriously poor cell service in certain areas. I tried to focus on reviewing my presentation materials, but worry gnawed at me. What I didn't know then, what Oliver would later tell me through tears in a hospital bed, was what Saturday would bring. According to Oliver, the morning started normally enough. Sarah and her family had arrived for breakfast, bringing chaos and Sarah's usual dramatic storytelling. Richard had planned an ambitious day that included the baseball game, followed by a cookout at their house. Oliver was excited but nervous about spending the entire day with the extended family. "Maybe we could just go to part of the game," he'd suggested tentatively over breakfast. "My shoulder's been bothering me, and sitting for hours might make it worse." "Your mother babies you too much," Richard had responded firmly. "A little discomfort never hurt anyone. Besides, these are excellent seats. Business associates of mine. We're not wasting them because of a minor ache." Sarah had chimed in with her usual performative concern. "Oh, sweetie, you'll be fine. Sometimes we just need to push through little discomforts. That's how we grow stronger." And so it was decided. What Oliver wanted or felt comfortable with was irrelevant. What the adults had planned took priority, a family dynamic I knew all too well from David's stories about his childhood. They left for the game around 11 a.m. Oliver wore the polo shirt Margaret had selected, along with khakis that were slightly too big for his thin frame. His backpack contained water, snacks, and his inhaler, which Margaret had grudgingly allowed after I'd emphasized his asthma concerns. The first few innings went well. Oliver enjoyed the game despite his shoulder discomfort, caught up in the excitement of his first Major League Baseball experience. They had excellent seats behind home plate, and Oliver was thrilled when a foul ball landed nearby. Richard's business associate, Mr. Patterson, even bought Oliver a team cap and hot dog. It was during the seventh inning stretch that everything went wrong. The crowd was standing, cheering, doing the traditional stretch and sing-along. Oliver stood with everyone else, raising his arms above his head in the classic stretch pose. That's when his shoulder, already strained from soccer and aggravated by the awkward sleeping position at his grandparents' house, finally gave out. The pain was instantaneous and excruciating. Oliver felt his shoulder slip out of place with a sickening pop that he could hear over the crowd noise. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that caused nearby fans to turn in concern. His arm hung at an unnatural angle, and the pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Margaret, Richard, and Sarah rushed to his side, finding him collapsed in his seat, crying and clutching his arm. "Something's wrong with my shoulder," he gasped between sobs. "It popped out. I think it's dislocated." Sarah knelt beside him, but her medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid. Richard examined Oliver's shoulder with the confidence of someone who'd never actually studied medicine but had strong opinions about everything. "It's probably just a strain," he concluded. "These things always seem worse than they are to children." But Oliver's shoulder was visibly deformed, sitting lower than the other one, with a hollow where the round part of the bone should be. Several nearby fans, including a woman who identified herself as a nurse, offered assistance. "That looks like a dislocation," she said with concern. "He needs medical attention immediately." Richard bristled at the interference. "Thank you, but we can handle our grandson's care. It's not as serious as it appears." The nurse persisted. "Sir, I work in an emergency room. That shoulder is definitely dislocated. If you don't get him to a hospital soon, you risk nerve damage and complications." Margaret stepped in, her social anxiety about causing a scene overriding her concern for Oliver's pain. "We appreciate your concern, but his uncle is a doctor. We'll have him examined properly." What they didn't mention was that Uncle James was an investment banker with an MBA, not a medical doctor. But the nurse, faced with the family's insistence and Oliver's grandparents' authoritative demeanor, reluctantly backed down. The solution they devised still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Rather than leaving the game immediately to seek medical care, they decided Oliver was being dramatic. Richard fashioned a makeshift sling from a stadium napkin and his own tie. Sarah declared that fresh air and distraction would help Oliver feel better. Most unforgivably, they forced Oliver to stay for the remaining 2 innings, insisting that leaving early would be wasteful and rude to Mr. Patterson, who had provided the tickets. Oliver sat in agony for another hour, his dislocated shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat, while his family prioritized social obligations over his medical needs. During those final innings, Oliver begged repeatedly to go to a hospital. The pain was making him nauseous, and his arm had started to tingle in a way that scared him. But each request was met with dismissal. "Boys don't cry over minor injuries," Richard kept saying. "You need to learn to push through discomfort." By the time they finally left the stadium, Oliver was pale and shaking from pain and shock. But instead of heading to the nearest emergency room, they drove straight back to the Thompson house for the planned cookout. Sarah's husband James had arrived with elaborate preparations for grilling steaks, and Margaret had spent hours preparing side dishes. "We can't waste all this food," Margaret rationalized. "And James came all this way. We'll ice Oliver's shoulder and see how he feels after dinner." At the house, their treatment consisted of ice packs, children's Tylenol, and instructions for Oliver to rest quietly in the guest room while the adults enjoyed their cookout. When Oliver continued to complain about the pain, Richard actually accused him of seeking attention and trying to ruin everyone's weekend. "Stop being so dramatic," Richard said sternly. "Your father never acted like this when he was hurt. David was tough. Maybe you need to learn to be more like him." The comparison to his dead father, delivered by his grandfather as criticism for being in genuine medical distress, broke something in Oliver that day. He stopped asking for help and endured his pain in silence, exactly as they wanted. Meanwhile, I was frantically trying to reach them from Denver. I'd called a dozen times throughout the afternoon and evening, growing increasingly panicked as Saturday night stretched on with no word from my family or son. By Sunday morning, I was beside myself with worry. No calls, no texts, nothing since Friday evening. The final session of my retreat wasn't until 1 p.m., but by 9 a.m., I'd made my decision. I informed the organizers of a family emergency, packed my bags, and headed to the airport for the first available flight back to Minneapolis. The entire trip home, my mind cycled through scenarios ranging from mundane technical problems to catastrophic accidents. By the time I reached the Thompson house around 4 p.m., my hands were shaking with anxiety and adrenaline. I noticed all the cars in the driveway: Richard's BMW, Margaret's Mercedes, and Sarah's Range Rover. At least they were home. I walked to the front door and used the key Margaret had given me years ago, a gesture that now felt like an invasion of privacy, but was necessary given their refusal to answer their phones. The scene in the living room was sickeningly normal. Margaret, Richard, Sarah, and James were playing bridge at the dining room table, wine glasses and cheese plates arranged elegantly nearby. All four looked up in surprise when I entered. "Rebecca, we weren't expecting you until this evening," Margaret said, her tone suggesting I'd committed some social breach by arriving unannounced. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Where's Oliver?" "He's resting upstairs," Sarah replied with forced cheerfulness. "He had a little tumble at the baseball game yesterday, but he's fine."
Just taking it easy.
The dismissive way she said it, "a little tumble," sent alarm bells ringing. What tumble? What happened? Richard sighed, setting down his cards with theatrical annoyance. He strained his shoulder during the 7th-inning stretch. "Nothing serious. We've been treating it with ice and rest." "If it's nothing serious, why didn't anyone call me?" "Why hasn't he called me?" Margaret offered her standard excuse about wanting Oliver to enjoy his weekend without technology dependence. But something about their collective demeanor, the way they avoided eye contact, told me this was worse than they were admitting. I didn't wait for more explanations. I headed upstairs toward the guest room, the adults following with continued assurances that I was overreacting. The sight of Oliver stopped me cold in the doorway. My son lay on the bed, his face pale and drawn with pain. His right arm was cradled against his body at an unnatural angle, supported by what looked like a makeshift sling constructed from kitchen towels. His shoulder sat visibly lower than the left one, creating an obvious deformity even to my untrained eye. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he whispered when he saw me, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "You came back early." I was at his side instantly, my heart breaking at the sight of my injured child. "What happened, sweetheart? What did they do to you?" Through broken sobs, Oliver told me about the pain during the stretch, the pop he'd heard, and the agonizing hours that followed. How they'd made him sit through the rest of the game, how they'd prioritized their cookout over his medical needs, how they'd dismissed his pain as dramatics. As he spoke, I gently examined his shoulder, my horror mounting. Even with my limited medical knowledge, I could see this was a serious dislocation. The deformity was obvious, and Oliver's description of numbness in his fingers suggested possible nerve involvement. I turned to face the 4 adults clustered in the doorway. "You made him sit through a baseball game with a dislocated shoulder? Then you brought him home instead of to a hospital?" "We gave him pain medication," Margaret defended weakly. "Children often exaggerate their discomfort." "That's not exaggeration," I said, my voice deadly calm. "That's a medical emergency that you ignored for over 24 hours. Richard stepped forward with his usual authoritative demeanor. "Now see here, Rebecca. We made a judgment call based on our experience. Sometimes these things look worse than they are." "Your experience?" I repeated incredulously. "You're an investment banker, not a doctor. My child has been suffering with a dislocated shoulder for an entire day because you were more concerned about your social plans than his well-being." Sarah tried to interject with her usual deflection. We were being careful not to overreact. Emergency rooms are expensive, and we thought— You thought wrong, I cut her off. I'm taking him to the hospital.
Now.
I gathered Oliver in my arms, surprised by how light he felt, though whether from adrenaline or his weight loss from not eating due to pain, I couldn't tell. As I carried him toward the stairs, the four adults followed with a bizarre mixture of defensive excuses and suddenly helpful suggestions. Should we come with you? Margaret asked as I settled Oliver carefully in my car. No, I answered without looking at her. You've done enough damage. The 15-minute drive to the nearest emergency room was tense with Oliver's whimpers at every bump in the road. I called ahead so they'd be ready for us, explaining the situation to the triage nurse. By the time we arrived, Oliver's pain had escalated to the point where he could barely speak. The emergency room staff took one look at Oliver's shoulder and immediately whisked us into a treatment room. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, was a kind woman who specialized in pediatric emergency medicine. After examining Oliver and ordering x-rays, her expression was grave. Oliver has a posterior shoulder dislocation, she explained, showing me the x-ray images. See how the shoulder joint has completely separated here? This is a serious injury that requires immediate reduction and careful monitoring for complications. What kind of complications? I asked, my throat tight with anxiety. Dr. Martinez's expression told me everything. With prompt treatment, this would have been straightforward. The delay in care has increased the risk of nerve damage, blood vessel injury, and long-term mobility issues. We need to reduce the dislocation immediately, but he'll likely need orthopedic follow-up and possibly physical therapy. I nodded, fighting back tears. And if this had been treated yesterday when it happened, it would have been much simpler. Less pain, faster healing, minimal risk of complications. The delay has made everything more difficult. As Oliver was prepared for the reduction procedure, I sat beside his bed, holding his uninjured hand. The guilt was overwhelming. I had trusted his grandparents with my most precious person, and they had failed him catastrophically. When Margaret, Richard, Sarah, and James appeared in the emergency room an hour later, I felt nothing but cold, crystalline rage. Dr. Martinez was explaining the procedure to me when they arrived, clustering awkwardly near the door of the treatment room. After reviewing Oliver's case, Dr. Martinez confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This child has been in significant pain for over 24 hours with a serious injury. I need to ask, why wasn't he brought in immediately? Before I could respond, Richard stepped forward with his usual bluster. We're his grandparents. We assessed the situation and felt it could wait until today. Emergency rooms tend to overtreat minor injuries. Dr. Martinez's expression hardened. Sir, there's nothing minor about a posterior shoulder dislocation in a child. This required immediate medical intervention. The delay in treatment has potentially complicated his recovery. As they prepared to take Oliver for the reduction procedure, I kissed his forehead, promising to be there when he woke up. The moment they wheeled him away, I turned to face the four people who had betrayed my trust so completely. How could you? I said quietly.
How could you let him suffer like that?
Rebecca, don't you think you're being overly dramatic? Margaret began. Children bounce back from these things quickly.
Dramatic?
I repeated, my voice rising. My 10-year-old son has been in agony for over a day because you were more concerned about a baseball game and a cookout than his medical needs. We used our best judgment, Richard insisted. Emergency rooms are full of unnecessary visits from overprotective parents. Your best judgment, I said, my voice deadly calm, nearly caused permanent damage to my child. A trained nurse at the stadium told you this needed immediate attention, and you ignore her. Sarah stepped forward with her usual deflection tactics. Kids are resilient, Rebecca. You're always so anxious about everything. Maybe this experience will teach Oliver to be tougher. Something inside me snapped completely. Tougher? He's 10 years old with a dislocated shoulder, and you think the lesson here is toughness? The lesson here is that the people who were supposed to protect him prioritized their own convenience over his well-being. James, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Look, we all feel bad about how this turned out, but hindsight is 20/20. We made the best decisions we could with the information we had. The information you had, I said slowly, included a visible deformity, obvious pain, and a recommendation from a medical professional. You had all the information you needed. You just chose to ignore it. The reduction procedure took about an hour, longer than expected due to the delay in treatment. When Dr. Martinez returned, her expression was cautiously optimistic. We've successfully reduced the dislocation, and Oliver is recovering well from the sedation. However, there is some soft tissue damage that will require careful monitoring and physical therapy. Long-term prognosis? I asked. With proper follow-up care and therapy, he should regain full function. However, there may be some lingering stiffness, and he'll be at higher risk for future dislocations. The delay in treatment has made his recovery more complicated than it needed to be. As Oliver woke up in the recovery room, his arm now properly immobilized in a professional sling, his eyes immediately found mine. "Mom," he whispered. "It doesn't hurt as much now." "That's good, sweetheart. The doctors fixed your shoulder. You're going to be okay." He glanced around the room, taking in the medical equipment and unfamiliar surroundings. "Are Grandma and Grandpa here?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share while he was still groggy from sedation. "They're here, but don't worry about that right now. Just focus on feeling better." As Oliver drifted back to sleep, still holding my hand, I made a decision that had been building for years. This was the final straw in a relationship that had been damaging from the beginning. When the 4 adults approached me in the hospital corridor, I was ready. "Stephanie," Richard began, using the authoritative tone that had silenced David throughout his childhood. "I think we need to discuss what happened and move forward constructively." "You're right," I said calmly. "We do need to discuss what happened. What happened is that you prioritized a baseball game and social obligations over my child's medical emergency. What happened is that you ignored advice from a medical professional because it was inconvenient. What happened is that you caused my son unnecessary pain and potentially permanent complications. We never intended for Oliver to be hurt," Margaret said weakly. "We love him." "Love isn't enough," I replied. "Love without responsibility, without putting his needs first, without listening when he's in pain. That's not love. That's selfishness." Sarah stepped forward, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I'd learned to recognize. "Rebecca, you're upset right now, and that's understandable. But we're family. We need to work through this together." I stared at her, remembering all the times David had described this exact dynamic. The way his family closed ranks when confronted with their mistakes, the way they reframed accountability as disloyalty, the way they made victims responsible for protecting their feelings. "No," I said quietly. "We don't need to work through anything. I need to protect my son from people who think their convenience is more important than his well-being." James cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I think everyone's emotions are running high right now. Maybe we should table this discussion until things cool down." "Things aren't going to cool down," I told him. "This isn't an emotional reaction. This is a recognition of who you really are and what you're capable of." Over the following days, as Oliver began his recovery at home, the magnitude of what had happened continued to unfold. Simple tasks like getting dressed or writing became challenges. Physical therapy 3 times a week would be necessary to restore full range of motion. The orthopedic specialist confirmed that the delayed treatment had indeed complicated his recovery, though he was optimistic about Oliver's long-term prognosis. My decision to cut ties with the Thompson family wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was the logical conclusion of a lifetime of evidence that they prioritized their own image and convenience over genuine care for others. I consulted with a family law attorney who confirmed that I had every right to restrict their access to Oliver given the medical neglect that had occurred. The aftermath was predictable. Margaret sent tearful letters claiming they missed Oliver and didn't understand why I was being so extreme. Richard had his lawyer send veiled threats about grandparents' rights, which my attorney quickly shut down with documentation of their neglect. Sarah told mutual friends that I was unstable and keeping Oliver from his loving family. But through it all, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since David's death. Without the constant undercurrent of criticism and judgment from his family, Oliver and I were free to build the kind of relationship based on trust, respect, and genuine care. Oliver's recovery progressed steadily. Within 3 months, he had regained most of his range of motion, though he would need to be careful with that shoulder for the rest of his life. More importantly, he learned valuable lessons about standing up for himself and recognizing when adults fail in their responsibilities. One evening, as we shared dinner at our small kitchen table, Oliver looked up at me thoughtfully. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened with Grandma and Grandpa Thompson." "What about it, sweetheart?" I asked. "I don't miss them as much as I thought I would," he admitted. "Is that bad?" "Not at all," I assured him. "Sometimes people show us who they really are, and it's okay to be disappointed." "I miss the idea of having grandparents who care about me," he continued with wisdom beyond his years. "But they cared more about their plans than about my pain. That's not how family should work." "You're absolutely right," I told him. "Real family puts your well-being first always." As we finished our meal together, I realized that we had both learned something valuable from this painful experience. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to walk away from relationships that cause more harm than good, even when those relationships are supposed to be the closest ones in your life. Family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by love, respect, trust, and the willingness to put each other's well-being first. Oliver and I had found that kind of family in each other, in our close friends, and in the community of people who had supported us through this crisis. The Thompson family continued their attempts to re-establish contact for several months, always framing themselves as the wronged party. But their complete inability to acknowledge the harm they had caused or take responsibility for their actions only confirmed that cutting ties had been the right decision. Oliver still carries a small scar on his shoulder from where the reduction procedure required a minor incision. But the emotional scars have healed better than I could have hoped, because we addressed them honestly and removed ourselves from the source of continued harm. Some relationships can't be repaired because one party refuses to acknowledge the damage they've caused. Some broken things are meant to stay broken, and the real healing comes from building something new and healthier from the pieces that remain. Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to protect yourself or someone you love from toxic family members? How did you find the strength to follow through? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth and your child's well-being are not determined by those who failed to value them. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of our new home, illuminating the photographs on the mantelpiece. Pictures of our hiking trips, Oliver's school plays, birthday parties with friends who had become our chosen family. 5 years had passed since that terrible weekend that changed everything. Oliver is 15 now, grown into a confident teenager with a kind heart and sharp mind. His shoulder has fully recovered. He even plays on the school basketball team, though he's learned to listen to his body in ways most kids his age don't need to. The physical therapy sessions that once dominated our schedule are now just a distant memory, replaced by college prep courses and weekend tournaments. I got that promotion I was working toward, and 2 years later, I was recruited by a larger firm where my work-life balance actually exists. We moved to this house in a neighborhood where Oliver's friends' parents have become some of my closest confidants. There's no manicured perfection here, just genuine community and support. The legal battles with the Thompson family ended 3 years ago, when Richard's lawyer finally convinced him that their case was hopeless. Margaret still sends birthday cards that we don't open. Sarah occasionally appears in social media suggestions, her perfect life still curated for public consumption. I feel nothing when I see their names now, not anger, not sadness, just the mild indifference reserved for strangers. Oliver rarely mentions them anymore. When he does, it's with the analytical distance of someone who has processed trauma and emerged stronger. "I used to think I was missing out on having grandparents," he told me recently. "But Mrs. Chun next door has been more of a grandmother to me than Margaret ever was." Mrs. Chun, our 78-year-old neighbor who taught Oliver to play chess and always has homemade cookies waiting after school. She's one of many people who proved that family is built through care, consistency, and choice, not blood. Last month, Oliver was accepted early admission to 3 universities with partial scholarships. His essay about resilience, accountability, and choosing your own family apparently resonated with admissions officers. As I watched him open those acceptance letters, I thought about the scared 10-year-old lying in that hospital bed, and I felt nothing but pride for the young man he's become. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret cutting ties with David's family. They wonder if Oliver misses having grandparents, if the holidays feel empty without extended family traditions. What they don't understand is that we didn't lose family that weekend. We discovered what family really means. But this story isn't really about where we ended up. It's about the choice that saved us both, and the weekend that taught me the difference between family and relatives. Let me tell you how it all began, and why sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. My name is Rebecca, I'm 34 now, and this is the story of how my son Oliver and I learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all.